You've been attending Shasta County Board of Supervisors meetings for almost a year, where you said that you're often the only person in the audience while they're making these decisions to spend tens of millions of dollars. Can you explain why citizen engagement is the missing piece?
Maximizing individual liberty. Defending inalienable rights. Protecting the Constitution. Welcome to the Liberty Enforcement Podcast.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about this. One of the things I'm really struck by is that, like the meeting you were at the other day, for example, you spoke as a public comment area time at the beginning of the meeting, and of course there were like 20 people in the audience, right? Or something, 20, 30 people, whatever it was. Well, the issue is that once you get past the public comment period, the meetings are held at 9 o'clock in the morning. And the issue is that when the board actually gets into discussing their actual agenda, most people are usually gone from the meeting. So it often ends up being one or two people in the audience. And here we are with all of the entire agenda being discussed. And now when I talk about the agenda, each one of these items might be $5 to $30 to $50 million worth of spending. And you have 20, 30 agenda items in some cases. And before every single one of those agenda items, they are required to give you public comment time, essentially, at least in Shasta County, based on our current order. So what we end up with is a dynamic where they rubber stamp all this stuff with absolutely no one paying attention, no questions being asked, and because there's no one in the audience.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, if you look at any agenda, it's the same story over and over and over again. 20 items, and they're saying $10 million to buy this house, $20 million to this agency, a pay raise to this agency head. They make all of these decisions, most of them having to do with spending money with zero questioning from the audience because there is no audience. So let's backtrack at this process. What we now have is we have the staff who have written the agenda that they're voting on within this meeting to basically raise their own paychecks in some cases, right? Like sometimes it's literally pay raises we're talking about.
For themselves.
For themselves, essentially. And there's no one in the audience to say, hey, is this a good idea? Literally, all we need to do is show up in front of the board and say, hey, well, if you're gonna spend $10 million to buy this house, is a good, well, how else can we spend the $10 million? Is this the best use of the money? Is the $10 million the cheapest way for us to acquire this property? Can we rent or lease it? What about all the extra costs we haven't considered? It's like the basic questions, just simple Socratic process of just asking questions is completely absent, and we need to restore that. We need to restore the civic engagement, and I think people feel like they have to know what they're talking about before you show up. And it's like, no, simply follow your curiosity. Like an agenda item comes up for discussion, it's very obvious if they're spending $10 million to buy a property, for example. There's very obvious questions that anyone can come up and just ask. Just say, hey, is this a market rate for this property? Just how much is the electric bill going to be? Just really basic questions that needs to start getting asked, because what we discover when that happens, and I've watched this happen recently, they don't have the answers. And they do not like looking stupid, because at that point they have to say, well, gee, we need these answers. So they start asking the staff, and if the staff can't answer that, they do not vote on it a lot of times. They will actually say, move it off to the next meeting. And I've seen a lot of back and forth like that happening as I've been attending the meetings. It's just a question of getting the people there and having the questions be asked.
Wow, that means you can have a lot of sway coming in and learning about these decisions that are being made and involving yourself in the process, because you might know more than they do about it, and they might defer to the citizen and their counsel over that issue than just rubber stamping it. is pretty much what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's half the issue right there. That's absolutely right. It's sometimes the public may know more about the issues than the supervisors do. The other thing is just basic care. I mean, it's just a basic issue that you look at our local politicians, and for the most part, they do not care about anything other than their pet projects. Like it's just like everyone else. This is basic humanity. We have things we care about that we focus our attention on that are relevant to us because attention follows relevancy. And then there's everything else. And so when everything else, 95% of the agenda items are things that the supervisors don't really have any particular interest in. So they just rubber stamp it because there's no competing dialogue as to what a better course of action might be, because the citizens are just not there. And that's a missing voice. Like that, as I keep saying, it's a critical voice that's missing because our government is supposed to work for us, and right now, I mean, like there is corruption, sure, but most of it is not corruption. Most of it is just simply people's agendas that are just not the agenda of the people.
So in Shasta County, most people show up for the public comment, which is good, but they leave before the meeting goes into the agenda items. And would you say we could make a lot more difference probably being involved in the agenda items than showing up earlier for the public comment?
I think that's very accurate. I think the issue is that, generally speaking, if you look at different boards, and we've just been looking at Shasta County as the Shasta County board because of all the political stuff that's been going on here in Shasta County. The reality is that there just isn't a whole lot of public engagement, period, at all the levels. It's like, when was the last time you showed up to any of these boards? And the fact that, in a county of 180,000 people, you have a board meeting and there might be 10 people present, there might be 50 people present, 50 people out of 180,000. Like that's really the issue, is that we've kind of forgotten that we have a civic duty to engage our representatives and to hold them accountable. And yeah, simply by showing up, sometimes it's really that easy. Just simply showing up and being like, hey, let's start asking questions about what you're doing over here and do basic civic engagement, basic civic duties that we've just somehow forgotten in this country. Somehow, some part of it's forgotten, part of it is that it's intentional, part of it is that they're holding these meetings at 9 a.m. in the morning intentionally to keep people from engaging with their political process. I mean, that's part of the way this, and if you want to talk about corruption, like that's a form of corruption. It's just not the kind of corruption we think about. But it's like, whoever sets the agenda, namely the staff, they certainly understand that their interest is as little oversight as possible. So of course we're going to end up with meetings at 9 a.m. in the morning where people cannot attend. Like that's how the system propagates itself, essentially. And it's not so much ugly corruption, it's just basic, I am going to optimize everything for my own basic interest. It's like, why would I optimize for civic engagement if that's just creating headaches for me as a staff person? Like, why would I want to have my bosses breathing fire down my neck when I can just keep them out of my sight? Yeah. And that's how we end up with 9 a.m. meetings instead of 6 p.m. meetings. And I think Shasta County had a 6 p.m. meeting a couple months ago. And I think the meeting ran until like 2 a.m. or something crazy like that, because people showed up.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like that's the deal. Is once people engage, they engage. But we have to have that engagement. We have to deal with all the roadblocks, and one of them is what we just talked about. 9 a.m. meetings are a huge problem. But it's just the way that we get 6 o'clock meetings is people showing up and demanding them. Like again, like this is the staff driving the agenda, and this is the most clearest example where the staff agenda and the staff views and goals are just in complete conflict with the goals of the people, essentially.
Okay, so how does a meeting work? Can we just go and talk to these people?
Great, that's an excellent question. So the short answer is yes. You can go and you can talk to people because under the Brown Act, they have to give you time to speak.
And we're talking about during the time for agenda items, not during the public comment.
So the Brown Act requires public comment. It doesn't specify how that public comment is handled. Because we've had citizen engagement in Shasta County, in the last few months, we had specifically a vote was taken by the board, and the board allowed for comment to happen before every single agenda items. So now you can speak at the public comment, and then you can speak before a vote is taken on every single item on the agenda. And so let's talk about a little bit about the agenda. So the agenda is published on usually here in Shasta County, it's published on like on a Sunday publicly. I think it's made available to the supervisors on a Thursday, if I'm not mistaken. But it's almost always online on a Sunday for a Tuesday meeting. Now, how does the agenda work? The agenda is simply a document that lists out, here is what's going to be talked about during this meeting. And if it's not on the agenda, they cannot talk about it because that's notice to the public that we're going to be discussing and voting on this specific item. So then you have the consent calendar and you have the regular calendar on the agenda. The consent calendar is 20, 30 items sometimes that they say it's routine and non-controversial, so they simply rubber stamp it with a single vote. And so you have $100 million for spending in some case or more, like a huge amounts of money. They're just being rubber stamped right there without much back and forth. So the reason and then you have the regular calendar, which is separate agenda items, and you have public comment before each one. Now, the thing about the consent calendar, and I've seen this play out over and over again, is that when the people show up and we say, wait a second, this should not be on the consent calendar, pull this out please, let's talk about this separately. All of a sudden you have something, these 20 items, 7 of them got pulled out, and we now have public comment under each one, and we have supervisors going back and forth. We've just completely changed the political process, essentially, just by showing up and saying, hey, we need to be talking about this separately. So you have the agenda, you have the calendar, and then once you go into each item, you have public comment before every item. And again, it just comes back to just simply asking questions. It's not about telling them what to do. It's about just using the Socratic process and just asking basic questions, sometimes with intent. It's okay to have intent. You know, if you're suspecting that they have no idea what they're talking about, ask a question that leads there.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's really that simple. So yeah, I mean, so you have the agenda, you have the meeting, and you have specific times for you can speak. And a lot of agenda items, it's just going to be 1 or 2 people speaking, and we need to change that. We need to have more people asking questions about how money is being spent.